The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to speak once again in this House on what I have called before and will call again one of the most ill-advised pieces of legislation that I have seen in my time here in the House of Commons. This Bill C-42 amends the Aeronautics Act to require airlines in Canada to send personal information on its passengers to foreign security services. In particular, Canadian travelers who are traveling to destinations that may touch U.S. airspace but do not land in the United States would have the decision over whether or not they're issued a boarding pass in Canada determined by U.S. Homeland Security. Now, Madam Speaker, there's so much wrong with this bill that it's hard to know where to start. So I'll start at the beginning. The passenger name record that an airline creates on each passenger when they book a flight to fly from Canada to, say, Mexico or Cuba or Latin America or Europe contains the following information. The file that a travel agent creates when you book a vacation, the name of your travel agent, credit card information, who you are traveling with, your hotel, booking information such as tours or rental cars, any serious medical condition of the passenger. This information that would have to be turned over to U.S. Homeland Security can be retained by the United States for up to 40 years. We know this because there's similar agreements that have contained this information. And this information may be forwarded to the security service of a third-party nation without the consent or the notification of the other signatory. No person may know what information is being held about them by the United States and may not even have a chance to correct that information if there are errors. The United States has signed agreements with other countries that are similar that may unilaterally amend the agreement as long as it simply advises the other party of those changes. In essence, Madam Speaker, once the passenger name record is logged by the airline and is sent to U.S. Homeland Security, U.S. Homeland Security will make a decision as to whether or not the person who is going to board that aircraft, a Canadian citizen who is going to board that aircraft in our country, will be allowed to board that aircraft or not. Now that is something so fundamentally wrong. It's so fundamentally wrong on the surface that it's hard to believe that anybody would proceed any further than that. Imagine having a Canadian citizen's right to fly to a country around the world determined by U.S. Homeland Security. I mean, is there anything more preposterous? Is there anything more undemocratic? Is there anything more offensive? Imagine a Canadian citizen who chooses not to go to the United States. They may make a deliberate decision not to go there. Has to have personal information about themselves transferred to security apparati in the United States, and decisions of whether they can fly or not determined by American authorities. Now, I've heard conservatives stand themselves and say, well, what can we do? You know, the Americans, they've asked for it and they won't let us fly over their airspace. Well, let's examine that. First of all, Canadian airlines have been flying over U.S. airspace for decades and decades and decades without having to send this personal information to the United States. That's number one. What's the difference now? Number two, why can't Canadian authorities retain control and the authority and the responsibility of the security of Canadian airlines?
Yeah, they can.
Okay? Canadian soldiers are good enough to fight in Afghanistan right now. They're good enough to fight right beside U.S. soldiers. They're good enough to work side by side in NATO and to be trusted with those. But the United States doesn't trust Canada to maintain adequate security over our own aircraft. I might also add that Canadian airlines and Canadian security apparatus have an outstanding record of controlling security in our country. I think, in fact, I would go so far as to say that it's superior to the security arrangements in the United States.
They won't pay for the computer.
Moreover, and here's the kicker, Canada sought and obtained an exemption from having to send information on Canadian citizens of the United States for domestic flights that fly over U.S. airspace. Now let's just stop for a minute and look at the absurdity of that. If in fact it's true that the Americans need this information about Canadian travelers to fight terror or to make sure that these flights are secure, how come they don't need it on domestic flights that fly over American states?
Exactly.
That's ridiculous. As a matter of fact, security steps and methods for international travel are actually superior and more in-depth than security checks for domestic flights. So you could argue that if it's the case that we actually needed these steps, then the one place that you would absolutely insist on there being a passenger name information sent to the United States would be on domestic flights. But it's the one thing that the Americans said is not necessary. Number two, I want to talk about the lack of reciprocity. You know, what kind of government sits down and negotiates with a foreign state and allows that state to demand personal information on our travelers, our own citizens, and doesn't insist on the reverse for our country? That's not negotiation. That's abdication, Madam Speaker. Now, what about the violation of Canadians' privacy? Again, a Canadian may want to take their family to Mexico. Many families have done that in the past 10 years. And they run the risk of having that decision turned down by the United States. Number two, what about Canadians traveling to Cuba? We all know that the United States has the Helms-Burton Act, where they prohibit their businesses and citizens from having any kind of dealing with Cuba. So we're going to have the United States determine whether or not Canadian passengers can go to Cuba or Latin America. And Canadians should know that it's not just Latin America. Of course, every Latin American flight will fly over U.S. airspace. Many, many flights that go to Europe and other parts of the world also touch U.S. airspace. This is, of course, also a profound violation of Canadian sovereignty. It's been pointed out by witnesses before the Transport Committee and the Public Safety Committee that decisions over whether Canada can invite diplomats from certain countries who would fly over U.S. airspace could essentially be vetoed by the U.S. government. Of course, the most profound violation of sovereignty is allowing a foreign government or institutions of a foreign government determine where our own citizens can travel in the world. Now, I sat in this House and we watched this government say that when they abolished the long-form census, a ridiculous move if there ever was one, that they thought it was not the state's business to know how many bedrooms a person had in their house. They said, the government of Canada, it was offensive that they would know how many bedrooms a Canadian citizen would have. At the same time, they signed an agreement with the United States that would sell out the information on a Canadian citizen, like their credit card information, or their health status, or where they're traveling, and they will sell that out and give it to a foreign government. That's ridiculous. Now, this government also likes to say that the primary duty of any government is to protect its citizens. Well, that's not being done here, Madam Speaker. It's a sad day in Canada right now to see this Conservative government not protecting Canadian citizens and not protecting their freedom and not protecting their rights to travel where they want in the world. Okay, this government is failing completely in that regard. And I want to talk for a minute about the Liberals' shameful record. The Liberals, after speaking against this bill and sounding like they actually understood the privacy and sovereignty issues, voted in favor of Bill C-42 at second reading. Every Canadian should know that when the leader of the official opposition stands up and questions this government on why the Canadian government is entering into security perimeter negotiations with the United States and selling out our privacy rights of Canadians to the United States, they're voting for it. The Liberals are voting for this very bill that gives U.S. Homeland Security the right to determine where Canadians travel. And the New Democrats are going to stand against that kind of cynicism. We're going to stand up for Canadians. We're going to stand up for privacy rights. We're going to stand up for Canadian sovereignty. And we're going to stand up for fair dealing of Canadian citizens to restore back Canada's place in the world where we're a country of fairness, where we're a country of decency and democracy, and we will stand up for our citizens to make sure that their fundamental rights are respected, Madam Speaker.